I am Daniel Foster, 71 years old, and I am currently living under the same roof as two people actively plotting to erase my existence. Lately, my daughter Sarah would quickly lock her phone whenever I came near, brushing it off by saying I was overthinking. Until one Tuesday evening, I glanced at her glowing screen on the kitchen counter and read a message I was never meant to see. The text from my son-in-law Mark read that the house appraisal came in at $1.2 million, and they just needed the doctor to sign the dementia paperwork on Friday to dump me at the Oak Creek facility. Before I tell you how I turned their own greed into a perfectly engineered trap, let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. Please hit like and subscribe if you believe that respect should never be replaced by exploitation. The kitchen was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the gentle whistling of the kettle. I had just poured hot water over chamomile leaves, preparing a cup of tea for Sarah. She had stepped out to the garage to fetch a package, leaving her phone resting on the marble island. It vibrated. The screen lit up, illuminating the dark countertop. I did not mean to snoop. I merely looked down out of habit, but the words burned themselves into my retinas. Appraisal came in at $1.2 million. Need the doctor to sign the dementia paperwork. Dump him at Oak Creek. List the house. The physical reaction was immediate and violent, though invisible from the outside. My heart, which had faithfully pumped blood through my chest for over 7 decades, seemed to stop entirely for a long, agonizing second. A cold sweat broke out across my shoulder blades. The hands that had built this life, that had rocked Sarah to sleep when she was an infant, began to tremble. Oak Creek was not a retirement community. It was a notoriously underfunded state-run facility where the forgotten elderly went to wither away in soiled sheets. My own daughter, the child I had protected my entire life, was planning to medically kidnap me and steal my home. The garage door handle rattled. Sarah was coming back. A lesser man would have screamed. A weaker father would have confronted her right then, demanding answers, crying tears of betrayal and begging for love. But I did not gasp. I did not shatter the ceramic mug in my hand. I experienced a profound, glacial psychological pivot. The father who loved unconditionally died in that exact moment, replaced by the man I had been in my professional life. I turned my back to the island, stepped toward the stainless steel sink, and began washing my own coffee mug from that morning. I focused on the temperature of the water and the slickness of the soap, forcing my breathing to slow down to a steady, rhythmic pace. Silence would be my first weapon. The door swung open. Sarah walked in, carrying a cardboard box. Her eyes instantly darted to her phone. She snatched it off the counter with a nervous, jerky motion, pressing the lock button so hard her knuckles turned white. She looked up at me, a tight, artificial smile plastered across her face. She asked if I had taken my heart medication today. The hypocrisy of her feigned concern was nauseating. I turned the faucet off, dried my hands on a towel, and matched her artificial smile with a warm, grandfatherly grin of my own. I told her I took the pills right after breakfast and thanked her for checking on me. I handed her the cup of chamomile tea. She took it, completely unaware that she had just handed me the blueprints to her own destruction. I wished her a good evening, turned around, and walked slowly down the hallway toward my study. I stepped into my study and firmly locked the heavy oak door behind me. The click of the brass deadbolt was the sound of a fortress sealing its gates. I walked over to my desk and looked at the framed photograph of my late wife, Patricia. We had bought this house 30 years ago. It was not inherited wealth or a lucky lottery ticket. It was the result of decades of grueling, meticulous work. Sarah and Mark had always treated me like a gentle, slightly clueless old man who merely worked in an office. They had completely forgotten what I actually did for a living. I did not just push papers. I spent 40 years as a senior corporate actuary for one of the largest insurance firms in the country. My entire career was dedicated to assessing risk, uncovering hidden liabilities, and dismantling complex financial fraud. I built a quiet, bulletproof real estate portfolio by identifying vulnerabilities that others missed. When Mark's logistics business started failing a year ago, Sarah came to me in tears, pleading for help. I allowed them to move into my home rent-free, believing I was providing a safety net for my family. Instead, I had invited parasites into my sanctuary. They looked at my quiet demeanor and saw weakness. They looked at my age and saw an expiration date. They vastly underestimated the intellect required to build the empire they were currently trying to steal. I sat down in my leather executive chair and opened my secure laptop. The grandfather persona evaporated entirely. I initiated my encrypted virtual private network and accessed my primary financial dashboards. If Mark was brazen enough to discuss property appraisals and forged medical documents via text message, he had likely already taken preliminary steps to secure his position. I needed a complete, unvarnished picture of my vulnerabilities. I pulled my comprehensive credit reports from all 3 major bureaus. I cross-referenced my social security number against recent inquiries. I scrutinized every single line of data with the cold, detached precision of an auditor. It did not take long to find the bleeding wound. Buried on the 3rd page of the credit report was a newly opened revolving line of credit. The balance was entirely maxed out at $40,000. The issuing bank was a commercial lender heavily associated with small business logistics financing. Mark had not just planned a future theft. He had already weaponized my identity to inject cash into his failing company. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing numbers on the screen. The conflict had fundamentally shifted. This was no longer just a tragic case of elder abuse or a greedy family dispute over an inheritance. Mark had committed wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. He had crossed a hard legal line, stepping directly into the territory of federal crimes. I did not feel anger anymore. I felt an absolute, terrifying clarity. They thought they were playing a game of emotional manipulation with a senile old man. But they had just sat down at a high-stakes chessboard against a grandmaster of financial ruin. I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out a fresh legal pad, and began to draft the exact sequence of moves required to completely obliterate their lives. Friday morning arrived with a heavy gray sky pressing down on the neighborhood. The weather perfectly matched the suffocating atmosphere inside my own home. I sat in my favorite leather armchair in the living room, with the daily financial newspaper resting on my lap. I was waiting for the performance to begin. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy brass doorbell rang. I heard Sarah rushing down the hallway. Her footsteps were loud and hurried on the polished hardwood floor. She opened the heavy oak door, and her voice immediately shifted into a high pitch of artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. She welcomed the guest and led him straight into the living room. I slowly lowered my newspaper and looked up to inspect the threat. The man standing next to my daughter did not look like any geriatric specialist I had ever encountered in my 71 years. He introduced himself as Dr. Evans. He wore a crisp white shirt and an expensive gray suit jacket. However, his eyes were entirely devoid of the deep warmth or the characteristic exhaustion typical of a real medical professional. He carried a sleek black leather briefcase and smiled at me with perfectly bleached teeth. He looked more like a predatory defense attorney than a man who had taken the solemn medical oath. Sarah stepped forward and placed a hand heavily on my right shoulder. She told me she had arranged a simple wellness check just to make sure my blood pressure and my memory were doing well. I looked down at her hand resting on my shoulder. Her fingers felt cold and stiff. I knew exactly what this man was actually here to do. He was here to lay the fraudulent medical foundation for my complete legal execution. He was the hired gun meant to sign away my rights. I nodded slowly, allowing my shoulders to slump just a fraction of an inch. I let my jaw go slightly slack. It was time to give them exactly the pathetic show they desperately wanted to see. I thanked Sarah for her concern and asked the fake doctor to take a seat on the comfortable sofa opposite my chair. Dr. Evans opened his sleek briefcase and pulled out a thick metal clipboard. He did not bring out a stethoscope. He did not bring out a blood pressure cuff or a thermometer. His only tools were a cheap ballpoint pen and a pre-printed checklist designed to systematically strip away my autonomy. He leaned forward, resting his elbows casually on his knees, and adopted a sickeningly sweet tone. It was the exact tone one might use when speaking to a very slow or frightened child. He asked me how I was feeling today. I purposefully paused for a long time before answering. I let several seconds of heavy, uncomfortable silence fill the living room. I looked around the walls as if I were trying to gather my scattered thoughts. I finally replied in a weak, raspy voice that I was feeling a bit tired and that the days seemed to be blending together lately. I saw Sarah shift her weight impatiently out of the corner of my eye. The doctor made a swift, aggressive note on his clipboard. He asked me if I could tell him the current date and the exact day of the week. I knew perfectly well that it was Friday, the 14th of November. My mind was sharp enough to calculate compound interest in my head. But I furrowed my brow deeply and stared blankly at the wooden coffee table. I raised my trembling hand and rubbed my temples, acting as though a thick, impenetrable fog had suddenly settled over my brain. I mumbled slowly that it was definitely a Tuesday. I guessed blindly that we were somewhere in late October. The loud scratch of the doctor's pen against the stiff paper echoed in the quiet room. Sarah let out a loud, highly exaggerated sigh. She muttered under her breath that this was getting much worse. She wanted to make sure the hired doctor noted my severe, fabricated confusion. Dr. Evans nodded sympathetically at my daughter, playing his part in this disgusting theater. He then turned his full attention back to me. He asked me to remember 3 simple words. The words were apple, table, and penny. He told me he would ask me to repeat those exact words in a few minutes. I nodded blankly, keeping my eyes wide and vacant. While he pretended to write down notes about my general physical appearance, I initiated the next crucial phase of my calculated performance. I began patting down the front pockets of my thick wool cardigan. I patted my chest, my sides, and then the seat cushions all around me. My movements were deliberately frantic and highly uncoordinated. I let a note of rising, genuine-sounding panic enter my shaky voice. I looked at Sarah and asked her loudly where my silver pocket watch was. I told her my father gave it to me before he died, and I needed to hold it right now. Sarah rolled her eyes toward the ceiling. She did not even try to hide her deep contempt this time. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest and spoke to me sharply, devoid of any daughterly affection. She told me I had not owned a silver pocket watch in over 20 years. She aggressively reminded me that I lost it on a fishing trip when she was still a teenager in high school. I stopped patting my empty pockets and looked up at her with wide, terrified eyes. I let my shaking hands drop heavily to my lap in apparent total defeat. I whispered brokenly that I could have sworn I was just holding the cold metal watch this very morning. Dr. Evans leaned back comfortably on the soft sofa. He looked directly at Sarah. They shared a look that instantly turned my stomach into a knot of cold steel. It was a look of absolute predatory triumph. It was the shared, silent communication of 2 scavengers who had just successfully cornered a wounded, helpless animal. A cruel smirk briefly played on the doctor's lips before he quickly hid it behind his fake professional facade. He looked back at me and asked softly if I could recall the 3 simple words he had mentioned earlier. I stared at him with complete emptiness. I opened my mouth, closed it, and shook my head slowly. I told him I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. I asked him in a confused whisper why he was asking me about apples. The doctor closed his metal clipboard with a loud, decisive snap. He stood up tall and buttoned his expensive suit jacket. He told Sarah that he had definitely seen enough for today. He used a deep voice dripping with fake, practiced pity. He explained that cognitive decline can happen incredibly rapidly at my advanced age, and that it was very good she called him when she did. He said he would prepare the necessary medical evaluation forms for her to review and sign by the end of the week. He strongly emphasized the word necessary. He was secretly telling her that the illegal paperwork required to declare me entirely incompetent would be ready for her signature. Sarah placed her hand gracefully over her chest, feigning deep relief and tragic heartbreak simultaneously. She thanked him profusely for his time. She said it was so incredibly difficult to watch her strong father slip away into darkness like this, but she just wanted what was best for my long-term safety. She eagerly offered to walk him out to his car. I remained frozen in my armchair, staring blankly at the blank wall, keeping up the pathetic charade until they were completely out of the room. I listened carefully to their footsteps fading down the long hallway. I heard the heavy front door open and eventually close shut. The absolute moment the brass deadbolt clicked shut, the fake fog instantly vanished from my eyes. My posture straightened completely. The calculated trembling in my aged hands ceased entirely. I stood up from the deep armchair with perfect, steady balance and walked purposefully over to the front living room window. I peeled back the edge of the fabric curtain just enough to see them standing together by the edge of the driveway. Dr. Evans was handing Sarah a small white business card. They were both smiling widely in the cold morning air. They truly thought they had won the ultimate prize. They firmly believed I was a crumbling, useless monument, ready to be quietly bulldozed and sold to the highest bidder. They had absolutely no idea that my memory was as sharp and unforgiving as a cut diamond. They had no idea that I effortlessly memorized the exact license plate number of the sleek black sedan the fake doctor was currently driving. I remembered the heavy gold college ring shining on his right hand. I remembered every single word of their condescending, treacherous dialogue. I let the curtain fall back into place, plunging the room back into shadows. I walked quickly toward the hallway closet to grab my heavy winter coat and my wooden walking stick. The poisoned bait had been successfully taken. They were completely and blindly committed to their fraudulent scheme. It was now time for me to secure the actual, legally binding medical evidence that would forcefully lock the steel jaws of my trap around their greedy necks. I pulled my phone from my pocket and called a private taxi to take me directly to the premium diagnostic clinic located downtown. My real, undisputed evaluation was about to begin. The private taxi navigated the quiet suburban streets, pulling away from the neighborhood where my traitors were currently celebrating their imagined victory. I instructed the driver to take me directly to the commercial district downtown. My destination was not a standard, crowded local hospital. It was the heavily secured, brightly lit glass tower of the Apex Neurological Institute. This was a private, premium diagnostic clinic known worldwide for its absolute discretion and its rigorous, unassailable medical standards. I paid the driver in cash, stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, and walked purposefully through the heavy revolving glass doors. The massive lobby was a sanctuary of polished marble and quiet efficiency. It was a stark, intentional contrast to the cheap, terrifying reality of the state-run facility Sarah had planned to dump me in. I approached the reception desk and stated my full name. I had called ahead from my secure phone the previous day to book an emergency, premium executive evaluation. I specifically requested their two most senior, board-certified neurologists for an independent, dual assessment. I did not care about the exorbitant out-of-pocket cost. I was happily purchasing the armor that would save my life and protect my legacy. A young nurse in crisp navy blue scrubs escorted me up to the 14th floor. She guided me into a spacious, soundproof testing room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the vast city skyline. A few minutes later, two doctors entered the room. Dr. Mitchell was a tall, serious man with decades of published research in cognitive preservation. Dr. Cross was a sharp, observant woman who specialized in advanced neuropsychological profiling. They introduced themselves formally and sat across from me at a wide mahogany table. I did not waste their valuable time with pleasantries or vague complaints about getting older. I looked them directly in the eyes and explained exactly why I was sitting in their clinic. I told them that hostile family members were actively attempting to declare me legally incompetent in order to seize my estate and lock me away. I told them I needed a comprehensive, exhaustive, cognitive evaluation. I needed them to push my brain to its absolute limits and document every single result. I needed undeniable, legally bulletproof evidence of my perfect mental acuity, and I needed it notarized today. Dr. Mitchell raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my directness, but he nodded in professional agreement. They unpacked their heavy testing materials, and the true evaluation finally began. The gauntlet they put me through was nothing like the pathetic, condescending performance in my living room earlier that morning. There were no simple, insulting questions about the day of the week or remembering 3 basic words. This was a grueling, 3-hour marathon designed to test every facet of human executive function, memory retention, and complex logical reasoning. Dr. Cross began with advanced verbal fluency and delayed narrative recall. She read a dense 3-paragraph story filled with specific names, dates, financial figures, and complex interpersonal relationships. I was instructed to simply listen. Then she moved on to an intense spatial reasoning exam. She placed dozens of oddly shaped, multicolored wooden blocks on the table and handed me a series of intricate geometric blueprints. I was timed on how quickly and accurately I could recreate the 3-dimensional structures. My hands, which had purposefully trembled just hours before to fool my daughter, now moved with absolute, fluid precision. I quickly categorized the blocks by color and shape, mentally mapping the entire structure before I even touched the wood. The decades I spent as an actuary involved visualizing complex, multi-layered webs of financial risk. Building these geometric puzzles felt like a simple warm-up exercise. I finished the final structure in less than half the allotted time. Dr. Cross quietly noted the exact seconds on her digital stopwatch, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to genuine intrigue. Dr. Mitchell then took over for the mathematical and logical sequencing portion of the exam. He fired off a series of rapid mental arithmetic problems, requiring me to continuously subtract complex prime numbers from a high starting figure while simultaneously tracking a secondary sequence of alternating letters. It was a test designed to deliberately induce cognitive overload and expose any hidden deficits in working memory. I closed my eyes, visualizing the numbers and letters on a massive blank spreadsheet in my mind. I answered him in a calm, rhythmic cadence, never missing a single beat or dropping a sequence. He then presented me with a series of complex logical paradoxes and moral reasoning scenarios, asking me to identify the underlying assumptions and flaws in each argument. I dismantled the problems effortlessly, applying the exact same cold, analytical framework I used to use to deny fraudulent insurance claims worth millions of dollars. I explained the difference between correlation and causation in his scenarios, pointing out the specific cognitive biases his questions were designed to trigger. I could see the 2 doctors exchanging brief, highly impressed glances. They realized they were not testing a declining patient. They were sparring with a sharp, highly trained peer. As the 3rd hour finally approached, Dr. Cross leaned forward and asked me to recall the detailed story she had read to me at the very beginning of the session. Without a single moment of hesitation, I recited the narrative perfectly. I provided the exact names, the specific dates, the precise financial figures, and the complex relationships. I even politely corrected a minor grammatical inconsistency she had made when originally reading the text aloud. When I finished, the testing room fell completely silent, save for the gentle hum of the climate control system. Dr. Mitchell slowly closed his thick testing manual. He looked at Dr. Cross, who gave a firm, definitive nod. Dr. Mitchell turned to me, and stated plainly that my cognitive function was not just normal for a man of 71 years. He said my executive function, memory retention, and processing speed were operating at the level of a highly educated professional in their absolute prime. He confirmed that any claim of dementia or cognitive decline was entirely baseless and medically impossible. I thanked them both for their thoroughness, but I reminded them that spoken words were not enough to stop the predators currently occupying my home. I needed the physical weapon. The doctors left the room and returned 20 minutes later with a stack of freshly printed official clinic documents. They had compiled a comprehensive, heavily detailed report of my performance across every single cognitive metric. It concluded with a definitive, legally binding statement from both independent neurologists affirming my absolute mental competence to manage my own medical and financial affairs. I read through the document carefully, ensuring every date, name, and medical license number was perfectly accurate. Finally, the clinic's resident notary public entered the room. She verified my government-issued identification. I watched with profound satisfaction as she stamped the thick, raised metal seal onto the final page of the medical certificates, followed by her official signature and the exact timestamp of the afternoon. I carefully slid the heavy stack of notarized documents into a sturdy leather folder. I stood up, shook the hands of both doctors, and walked out of the glass tower. The crisp afternoon air felt entirely different now. When I woke up this morning, I was a victim caught in the crosshairs of a ruthless conspiracy. Now I possessed the undeniable medical proof that would shatter their entire legal foundation. The fake doctor they hired was a cheap, fragile illusion. My documentation was the absolute truth, backed by the full weight of medical science and legal verification. I hailed another taxi to take me directly to the financial district. The medical fortress was now built. It was time to secure the financial weaponry. It was time to go see my attorney. I left the financial district taxi stand and walked toward the towering glass and steel structure of Walsh & Associates. The wind coming off the harbor was biting, but I barely felt the cold against my face. I was a man moving with absolute and mechanical purpose. The lobby of the law firm was a sprawling cathedral of dark mahogany paneling and polished brass fixtures. It smelled of expensive roasted coffee and quiet, immense power. This was my true arena. I had spent 40 years of my life navigating rooms exactly like this one, negotiating complex corporate mergers and ruthlessly dissecting liability clauses. Sarah and Mark truly believed I belonged in a sterile state facility smelling of cheap bleach and boiled cabbage. They had entirely forgotten that I was a creature of boardrooms and binding contracts. I walked past the massive security desk and took the private executive elevator up to the 32nd floor. The senior receptionist greeted me warmly by my first name and immediately ushered me down the long, carpeted hallway into the main corner office. Bradley Walsh was waiting for me. Bradley was not just an ordinary estate attorney. He was a highly feared former federal prosecutor who had built a formidable private practice entirely dedicated to destroying white-collar criminals and untangling massive financial frauds. We had worked together closely decades ago when my insurance firm needed vicious outside counsel to prosecute a massive, multi-state syndicate fraud. He was sharp, utterly ruthless in a courtroom setting, and possessed a brilliant mind that viewed human greed as a highly predictable mathematical equation. Bradley stood up from behind his massive oak desk and extended a warm, firm hand. We exchanged brief, professional pleasantries, but he knew me well enough to immediately see the cold, unyielding intensity radiating from my posture. He asked me to sit in one of the plush leather chairs opposite his desk and offered me a glass of sparkling water. I declined the water politely. I unzipped my heavy leather portfolio and placed the thick stack of freshly notarized medical certificates directly in the center of his pristine desk blotter. I did not say a word. I simply told him to read the medical conclusion printed on the final page. Bradley put on his wire-rimmed reading glasses and scanned the dense medical jargon. A low, appreciative whistle escaped his lips. He looked up over the rim of his glasses and asked me why a perfectly healthy 71-year-old man had just subjected himself to the most rigorous, exhausting neurological battery available in the state. I did not soften the ugly truth. I looked my old friend directly in the eye and told him that my only daughter and my son-in-law were actively conspiring to declare me legally incompetent. I calmly explained their insidious plan to dump me in a notoriously abusive facility just so they could liquidate my entire estate and fund their own lifestyle. I then reached back into my portfolio and placed the printed credit report directly on top of the medical files. I pointed a steady finger to the newly opened, completely maxed out line of credit. I told Bradley that Mark had already crossed the line from elder abuse into federal territory. I explained that Mark had committed felony identity theft by using my social security number to funnel $40,000 into his failing logistics company. The warmth completely vanished from Bradley's eyes, quickly replaced by the cold, hard stare of an apex predator locking onto its prey. Bradley leaned back in his heavy leather chair and steepled his fingers together in deep thought. He asked me what my exact objective was in this situation. He offered to pick up his phone, call his contacts at the district attorney office right now, and have Mark arrested for wire fraud before dinner time. I shook my head slowly. I explained that a sudden, simple arrest would be far too easy and far too kind. It would immediately give Sarah the perfect opportunity to play the innocent victim, claiming she knew absolutely nothing about the credit fraud, and she would still be comfortably living in my house. I wanted a total, catastrophic dismantling of their entire reality. I needed to ensure that the very legal foundation they thought they were standing on was completely vaporized out from under them. Bradley nodded slowly, a dark and understanding smile forming on his face. We immediately began to construct my legal fortress. I told him my current estate plan was structured around a standard revocable living trust and a traditional last will and testament. Bradley immediately pointed out the critical, fatal vulnerability in that standard, everyday setup. He explained that a revocable trust meant I still retained direct legal control over the assets within it. If Sarah and Mark successfully managed to find a corrupt doctor willing to sign a fake declaration of incompetence, they could potentially use a forged power of attorney document to forcefully breach a revocable trust. Furthermore, a traditional will must go through the highly public probate court system after death. This meant Sarah could easily tie up my estate in costly, exhausting litigation for years by falsely claiming I was under severe undue influence when I wrote it. We needed something entirely bulletproof to stop their scheme dead in its tracks. The ultimate solution, Bradley explained with clinical precision, was the immediate establishment of an irrevocable blind trust. The legal mechanics of this specific financial vehicle were beautifully devastating. In a standard trust setup, you put your house and your money in a safe box, but you keep the master key to the box in your pocket. In an irrevocable trust, you build a reinforced titanium vault. You place your house and all your liquid assets inside that vault, and then you completely destroy the only key. By signing the transfer documents today, I would legally and permanently cease to be the actual owner of the $1.2 million property. The house would officially belong to the Foster Family Trust, which is a separate, impenetrable legal entity entirely detached from my personal name. Because it is strictly irrevocable, the action cannot be undone, altered, heavily modified, or challenged in any court without a massive legal hurdle that requires the explicit consent of the designated independent trustee. I decided to appoint Bradley's powerful law firm as the primary independent trustee of the estate. This specific maneuver meant that even if Sarah and Mark somehow produced a forged medical document and a fake power of attorney claiming they had total control over my daily affairs, it would be entirely and laughably useless. They simply could not sell the house because Daniel Foster no longer legally owned the house to begin with. The blind aspect of the trust added an additional, impenetrable layer of psychological and financial armor. A blind trust dictates that the potential beneficiaries have absolutely no legal right to any knowledge of the trust's holdings or its management strategies. Sarah and Mark would have zero legal standing to ever demand an accounting of the funds. They could not view the property deeds, and they could never access the bank statements. They would be completely, legally locked out of the financial architecture of my entire life. We spent the next 2 solid hours drafting the incredibly dense, highly specific legal language required to execute this massive transfer of wealth. We meticulously moved every single dollar from my personal checking accounts, my savings accounts, and my lucrative investment portfolios directly into the highly secure trust accounts managed entirely by Bradley's firm. We filed the expedited digital paperwork with the county clerk to immediately transfer the deed of the house into the name of the new trust. We also set up a secondary, highly secure debit account with a strict, minimal monthly allowance solely intended for my basic groceries and utilities. This brilliantly insulated my true, massive wealth from any further identity theft attempts by Mark. Bradley printed the towering stack of final legal documents and placed a heavy gold-plated fountain pen on the desk between us. He looked at me with deep, unwavering sincerity. He warned me that this exact moment was the absolute point of no return. Once my signature touched the paper, I was effectively making myself legally destitute on paper, while completely handing over the administrative control of my life savings to his firm. He asked me if I was entirely certain I wanted to execute this permanent nuclear option against my own flesh and blood. I thought about the cold, calculating text message glowing on Sarah's phone screen. I thought about the fake doctor sitting in my living room, treating me like a mindless, dying animal. I picked up the heavy fountain pen without a single tremor in my hand. I told Bradley that my flesh and blood died the moment they planned to throw me into the horrors of Oak Creek. I signed my name firmly and aggressively on the bottom line of every single page. The black ink dried quickly, finalizing the absolute legal severing of my estate from my treacherous family. With the impenetrable fortress fully built and my wealth perfectly secured, we needed to lay the final piece of bait for the upcoming trap. I asked Bradley to draft a fake, entirely worthless document, boldly labeled as my last will and testament. I wanted this decoy document to explicitly state that I was happily leaving the house, all my investments, and my entire life savings to Sarah and Mark, with absolutely no conditions attached. I wanted the legal language to sound incredibly generous, deeply loving, and completely naive. Bradley chuckled softly as his fingers flew across his keyboard to draft the useless piece of paper. He understood exactly what psychological game I was playing. If Mark and Sarah were already rushing their timeline because of Mark's failing logistics business, finding a document that promised them unconditional millions would completely blind them with overwhelming greed. It would make them incredibly arrogant. It would make them terribly sloppy. And it would absolutely guarantee they would spring the final trap precisely when and where I wanted them to. I took the freshly printed fake will, slid it carefully into a thin manila envelope, and placed it into my briefcase. I shook Bradley's hand, feeling a profound, absolute sense of peace wash over my soul for the first time in days. The vulnerable, targeted old man who had woken up this morning no longer existed. I was now a ghost in the financial system, completely untouchable, waiting patiently for my enemies to joyfully step into the deep abyss they had unknowingly dug for themselves. The taxi dropped me off 2 blocks away from my house to ensure Sarah would not hear a vehicle pull into the driveway. I walked the remaining distance with a steady, measured pace. The winter wind was sharp against my face, but the heavy manila envelope tucked safely inside my coat provided a profound, burning warmth. I unlocked the front door quietly. The house was entirely silent. Sarah was likely in her bedroom upstairs, scrolling through her phone or shopping online with the credit card Mark had fraudulently opened in my name. I walked silently down the hallway and entered my study. I did not turn on the main overhead light. I only switched on the small brass reading lamp resting on my solid oak desk. It cast a warm, concentrated pool of light directly onto the polished wood. This desk had always been completely off-limits to everyone in the family. For years, I kept it meticulously locked and organized, but today I was leaving the gates wide open. I pulled the fake last will and testament from my coat. It was printed on thick, expensive legal paper, heavily embossed with the intimidating logo of Bradley Walsh and Associates. I placed it directly in the center of the illuminated desk pad. I did not leave it perfectly aligned. I skewed it slightly to the left and left the flap of the envelope carelessly open. I wanted it to look exactly as though an anxious, declining old man had been frantically reviewing his final affairs after a terrifying morning doctor visit and simply forgot to put it away. I needed absolute confirmation that she took the bait. I could not simply rely on guesswork or assumption. In my decades of investigating corporate fraud, I learned that criminals only reveal their true nature when they firmly believe they are completely unobserved. I reached into my briefcase and retrieved a small, unassuming black cube. It was a high-definition wireless security camera, no larger than a standard phone charger. I had purchased it weeks ago when I first suspected Mark was snooping through my incoming mail. I plugged the discreet device into the wall outlet directly across from my desk, perfectly disguised among a tangle of computer cords. The lens was angled to capture the entire workspace in the doorway. I synced the camera feed to my secure smartphone, verifying the crisp, clear video connection. Then, I intentionally left the study door cracked open exactly 3 inches. It was an irresistible invitation to a thief. I walked to the bottom of the stairs and called out loudly to Sarah. I kept my voice intentionally shaky and weak. I told her I was feeling a bit overwhelmed from the doctor appointment and was going to take a slow walk down to the neighborhood park to get some fresh air. I heard her bedroom door open quickly. She leaned over the upstairs railing, feigning deep concern, and told me to be very careful and to take my time. I promised her I would, closed the heavy front door behind me, and walked slowly down the street. I did not go to the park. I walked 3 blocks to a small, quiet coffee shop, ordered a black espresso, and sat in a corner booth facing the brick wall. I pulled out my phone and opened the live camera application. The study remained empty for exactly 4 minutes. Then, the heavy oak door slowly pushed open. Sarah stepped into the room. The high-definition camera captured every single micro-expression on her face. She looked around nervously, her eyes darting to the corners of the ceiling, completely unaware of the tiny black cube near the baseboard. She crept toward the desk, her eyes immediately locking onto the bright pool of light from the brass lamp. When she saw the thick legal envelope with the bold words "Last Will and Testament" printed on the front, her entire body stiffened. She stopped breathing. I watched my own daughter transform from a supposedly concerned caregiver into a ravenous vulture right before my eyes. She wiped her sweating hands on her jeans, as if preparing to handle a priceless historical artifact, and reached for the thick paper. She pulled the document from the envelope and began to read. I had meticulously crafted the first paragraph with Bradley to be as overwhelmingly generous as possible. It explicitly stated that due to her immense sacrifice in caring for me during my declining years, she and Mark were the sole, unconditional beneficiaries of my entire estate. I watched Sarah's eyes widen as she scanned the fabricated financial figures. The fake document listed the house, my life insurance policies, and a completely fictitious offshore investment account totaling nearly $3 million. She covered her mouth with her trembling hand. A look of pure, unadulterated ecstasy washed over her face. She did not shed a single tear of grief at the thought of her father passing away. She was simply doing the math. She pulled her phone from her back pocket with frantic, jerky movements and dialed a number. The camera microphone was highly sensitive, picking up her hushed, breathless voice perfectly. She told Mark to come home immediately. She whispered frantically that I had left my will on the desk and that it was better than they ever could have imagined. She told him there were no restrictive trusts, no charity donations, and no legal hurdles to fight in court. She read the forged clause stating that everything would instantly transfer to them upon my passing or upon my legal medical incapacitation. She emphasized the word incapacitation heavily, repeating it twice so Mark understood the exact implication. The trap had snapped shut flawlessly. By feeding them this massive, irresistible lie, I had completely neutralized any lingering caution or hesitation they might have had. If they believed they were guaranteed millions the absolute second a doctor declared me incompetent, they would not wait another month. They would not even wait another week. The staggering amount of fake wealth staring back at her made Mark's failing business and his desperate creditors seem like trivial, temporary annoyances. They now had a massive, fictional safety net that emboldened them to commit their final crime. I watched Sarah carefully slide the document back into the manila envelope. She placed it exactly where she found it, ensuring the slight leftward skew remained perfectly intact. She tiptoed out of the study and gently pulled the door shut, leaving the crack exactly as it was. I closed the application on my phone and finished my espresso. The coffee tasted exceptionally rich and deeply satisfying. They were now blinded by a monumental, manufactured greed. They firmly thought they had secured their golden ticket to a life of luxury. This blinding greed would force them to make their final, fatal move recklessly and immediately. I knew without a shadow of a doubt that Mark would push the forged power of attorney paperwork in my face the very next day. They were rushing headfirst toward the edge of a sheer cliff, and they were absolutely thrilled to be running. I stood up from the booth, wrapped my thick winter coat tightly around my shoulders, and began the slow, victorious walk back to my fortress. Wednesday afternoon brought a palpable shift in the atmosphere of my home. The quiet, suffocating tension that usually hovered in the hallways was entirely replaced by a frantic, vibrating panic. Mark had come home from his logistics warehouse 3 hours earlier than usual. I was sitting in the living room, quietly reading a historical biography, but my senses were completely locked onto his erratic movements. He paced the length of the kitchen floor like a caged animal. His expensive dress shirt was untucked, and heavy sweat stained the collar. He continuously checked his phone, aggressively swiping the screen and muttering dark curses under his breath. The fake will I had left on my desk had successfully blinded them with the promise of future wealth. But the harsh, unforgiving reality of Mark's immediate financial ruin was currently breathing directly down his neck. The $40,000 credit line he had fraudulently opened in my name was merely a tiny bandage on a massive arterial bleed. His company was not just struggling, it was actively drowning in a sea of toxic debt. His cell phone vibrated violently against the marble kitchen island. The sharp buzzing sound made Mark physically jump. He stared at the glowing caller identification screen as if it were a venomous snake. He snatched the phone and practically ran out the back door onto the patio, sliding the heavy glass shut firmly behind him. He thought the thick glass would muffle his voice, completely forgetting that I had installed a highly sensitive security system with exterior audio sensors just last year. I calmly reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and accessed the patio camera feed. The audio came through crystal clear. Mark was pleading. The man on the other end of the line was a commercial debt collector, and his tone was entirely devoid of mercy. The collector explicitly told Mark that the grace period had officially expired. If a wire transfer of $80,000 was not deposited into their holding account by the end of the week, they were going to legally seize all 7 of Mark's delivery trucks and lock the gates to his primary distribution warehouse. Mark ran his trembling hand heavily over his face. He begged the collector for just a few more days of patience. His voice cracked, stripping away every ounce of the arrogant, successful businessman persona he constantly paraded around my house. He frantically explained that a massive real estate transaction was practically finalized. He swore on his life that he would have access to over $1 million in liquid cash by the following week. He was, of course, talking about my home. He was leveraging the roof over my head to buy himself a few miserable days of borrowed time. The collector laughed, a harsh, metallic sound over the speakerphone, and told Mark that promises did not pay commercial leases. The collector gave him exactly 48 hours to produce the funds before the repo teams were dispatched. The line went dead. Mark dropped his phone onto the patio table. He gripped the metal railing of the wooden deck so hard, his knuckles turned completely white. He was hyperventilating, drawing in ragged, shallow breaths of the cold winter air. The sliding glass door opened. Sarah stepped out onto the patio, wrapping a thick cashmere cardigan tightly around her shoulders to block the wind. She asked him what was wrong, her voice laced with high-pitched anxiety. Mark turned to her, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He did not soften the blow. He told her his business was officially dead. He told her the commercial creditors were coming for the delivery trucks on Friday morning, and once the business collapsed, the personal liability clauses would allow the banks to come after their private checking accounts. Sarah gasped loudly, her hands flying to cover her mouth. She frantically reminded him about the incredible will she had found in my study just a few days ago. She whispered that they were guaranteed nearly $3 million in total assets, and they just needed to wait for the fake doctor to finalize the incompetence paperwork so they could legally take control of the estate. Mark violently shook his head. He stepped closer to her, his voice dropping to a dangerous, desperate hiss. He told her waiting was no longer an option. Mark aggressively pointed a finger back toward the house. He declared that if the logistics company fell into bankruptcy before they secured my assets, the legal fallout would freeze everything, including whatever they managed to steal from me. He told Sarah the fake doctor's paperwork would take far too long to process through the state medical board and the local courts. He needed absolute, immediate financial control right now, today. The immense greed sparked by the fake will, perfectly combined with the crushing terror of his immediate bankruptcy, pushed him exactly where I needed him to go. He completely abandoned all caution. He told Sarah he had already drafted a comprehensive, durable power of attorney document that would grant him immediate, unquestionable access to every single bank account and property deed in my name. Sarah looked terrified. She asked him how he possibly expected to get a supposedly senile old man to willingly sign away his entire life without raising suspicion. Mark smiled, and it was the ugliest, most sinister expression I had ever seen on a human face. He told her he was going to bury the legal trap deep inside a stack of routine medical insurance updates. He firmly believed I was far too confused and exhausted to ever read the fine print or notice the difference. The timeline was now violently accelerated. The pressure cooker had reached its absolute boiling point. The final showdown was imminent, and they were sprinting blindly into my crosshairs. Thursday morning broke with a freezing rain that violently lashed against the large windows of my study. I was sitting quietly in my leather chair, sipping a cup of dark roast coffee, completely prepared for the inevitable assault. The frantic, desperate energy that had consumed Mark on the patio the previous afternoon had now calcified into a dangerous, manic determination. He had not slept. I could hear his heavy, uneven footsteps pacing the hardwood floors of the upstairs hallway since 3 a.m. His commercial creditors had given him an absolute deadline of 48 hours to produce $80,000, or his logistics company would be systematically dismantled and seized. He was a cornered, terrified animal, and I knew with absolute certainty that he was coming for me today. At exactly 9 a.m, the heavy oak door to my study swung open. Mark stepped into the room. He had made a pathetic attempt to look put together, wearing a crisp blue dress shirt and a dark tie, but his bloodshot eyes and the dark bruised circles under them completely betrayed his immense panic. He was clutching a thick, overstuffed manila folder so tightly against his chest that the cardboard was buckling under the pressure of his fingers. He closed the door behind him and walked over to my desk, forcing a wide, entirely unnatural smile onto his exhausted face. He pulled up a wooden chair and sat down far too close to me, immediately invading my personal space. This was a classic, aggressive intimidation tactic often used by amateur salesmen, designed to make the target feel cornered and perfectly compliant. He dropped the thick folder onto my pristine desk pad and let out a long, highly exaggerated sigh, rubbing the back of his neck as if he were carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. He adopted a sickeningly sweet, overly patient tone of voice. He told me he was so terribly sorry to interrupt my quiet morning reading, but the supplemental health insurance company was being an absolute nightmare regarding the recent home visit from Dr. Evans. He spoke incredibly fast, slurring his words together to intentionally create a sense of overwhelming, bureaucratic confusion. He claimed the insurance agents were threatening to completely cancel my premium prescription coverage by the end of the week if they did not receive a fully updated stack of authorization forms immediately. He opened the folder and rapidly spread a dozen pages of dense, incredibly boring medical legalese across my desk. He kept his large hands planted firmly on top of the pages, physically controlling the documents so I could not easily pull them closer to read the fine print. Mark pulled a cheap plastic ballpoint pen from his shirt pocket and clicked it rapidly with his thumb. The sharp clicking sound echoed like a metronome ticking down to his impending destruction. He pointed the plastic tip to a yellow highlighted line at the very bottom of the first page. He told me it was just standard bureaucratic nonsense, mostly updated privacy policies and routine billing authorizations. He gently tapped the paper and urged me to just quickly sign my name so he could scan them and email them to the insurance broker before the noon deadline. He was purposefully trying to overwhelm my processing speed, entirely convinced that my 71-year-old brain was far too sluggish and confused to notice the lethal trap he had buried in the middle of the stack. I leaned forward slowly, squinting my eyes heavily, and purposefully let my hands tremble just a fraction of an inch as I hovered over the documents. I played the role of the overwhelmed, obedient old man perfectly. I slowly signed the first 2 pages, which were indeed genuine, harmless medical privacy disclosures. Then, Mark smoothly slid the 3rd document directly in front of me. He kept his left hand resting heavily over the top half of the page, conveniently covering the bold, capitalized header. But my eyes were as sharp as a hawk locking onto its prey. I easily caught a glimpse of the dense legal text halfway down the page. I recognized the specific statutory phrasing immediately. It granted the designated agent the absolute, unhindered authority to execute real estate transactions, liquidate financial portfolios, and completely drain all banking institutions without the prior consent or notification of the principal assigner. It was a comprehensive, highly aggressive, durable power of attorney. This was the weapon he planned to use to steal my house and completely loot my life savings to pay off his desperate commercial debts. My heart beat with a steady, icy rhythm. I looked up at him, widening my eyes in a perfect imitation of senile confusion. I told him the text on this page looked very different from the others. I asked him in a weak, raspy voice what exactly this specific document was for. A thick bead of sweat rolled slowly down the side of Mark's face, disappearing into his shirt collar. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. But the blinding greed he felt after reading the fake will the day before pushed him to tell the ultimate, unforgivable lie. He did not even blink. He looked his father-in-law directly in the eyes and calmly stated that it was simply a special pharmacy release form. He claimed it was absolutely necessary so he could legally pick up my heart medication from the local pharmacy if I was ever feeling too tired to drive there myself. He smiled warmly, patting my shoulder, and told me he was just trying to take care of me and make my life a little bit easier. The sheer, terrifying audacity of his lie was almost impressive. He was staring directly into my eyes while actively plunging a knife straight into my back. I offered him a weak, grateful smile in return. I told him he was such a good, helpful son to take on all this terrible paperwork for an old man. He eagerly offered me his cheap plastic pen to sign the deadly document. I raised my trembling hand and gently waved his pen away. I told him I never signed important legal documents with cheap plastic. I slowly reached into the breast pocket of my thick wool cardigan and pulled out a heavy silver-capped fountain pen. I unscrewed the cap with agonizing slowness, letting the polished metal gleam under the warm light of the desk lamp. Mark let out a frustrated, impatient breath, clearly annoyed by my slow movements, completely unaware that he was watching me unsheathe the very blade that would end his entire life. During my 40 years as a senior actuary, I had personally investigated hundreds of millions of dollars in highly sophisticated corporate fraud. I had seen every trick, every forgery, and every manipulation the human mind could conjure. 15 years ago, a private security contractor I had worked with closely on a massive embezzlement case gifted me this specific, custom-made pen. It was not filled with standard commercial ink. It contained a highly specialized, chemically volatile blue compound, originally developed for covert intelligence operations. When applied to standard paper, the ink bonded beautifully with the fibers, appearing bold, dark, and entirely permanent. However, the chemical structure was deliberately designed to violently react with the ambient oxygen in the air. Over the course of exactly 48 hours, the blue pigment would completely evaporate into the atmosphere, vanishing without a single visual trace. The only thing it left behind was a microscopic, invisible chemical residue that could only be detected under a high-powered forensic blacklight. I pressed the delicate gold nib of the fountain pen against the forged power of attorney document. I signed my full legal name with perfect, fluid precision. The deep blue ink soaked into the thick paper, looking incredibly official and entirely permanent. I lifted the pen and capped it with a soft click. Mark did not even wait for the ink to dry. He practically snatched the document off the desk pad, pulling it securely against his chest. A massive, shuddering breath of profound relief escaped his lips. His entire posture completely transformed. The panicked, cornered animal instantly vanished, replaced immediately by a deeply arrogant, victorious predator. He had done it. He firmly believed he now held the absolute legal key to my entire empire. He quickly gathered the rest of the useless insurance papers, stuffed them carelessly into the manila folder, and stood up from the wooden chair. He barely even looked at me as he turned toward the door. He threw a quick, dismissive thank you over his shoulder, telling me he had to rush to the bank immediately to file the paperwork before they closed for the afternoon. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, listening to his rapid footsteps echoing down the hallway, followed by the heavy slam of the front door and the screeching tires of his car speeding out of the driveway. I picked up my dark roast coffee and took a long, deeply satisfying sip. The bitter liquid tasted like absolute victory. Mark was currently rushing to his office, entirely convinced he was about to steal over $1 million. He had absolutely no idea that he was holding a document that would become completely blank in exactly 2 days, completely destroying his life right in front of a real estate broker. The final countdown had officially begun. The heavy silver-capped fountain pen felt cold and substantial between my aged fingers. It was a beautiful, meticulously crafted instrument, formed from brushed steel with a solid gold nib, completely unassuming to the untrained eye. Mark stood hovering over my desk, practically vibrating with a toxic mixture of impatient greed and barely concealed panic. He watched me adjust my grip on the barrel, his bloodshot eyes entirely locked onto the polished tip of the pen. He was completely oblivious to the immense, catastrophic danger he was currently standing in. He thought he was watching a frightened, confused old man struggling with a simple, routine clerical task. He had absolutely no idea he was watching a seasoned executioner slowly and deliberately sharpening the blade of a guillotine. I let my hand shake just a fraction of an inch, perfectly selling the physical frailty that he so desperately wanted to see. Internally, my mind remained as perfectly still, cold, and unforgiving as a frozen lake in the dead of winter. To understand the absolute, unshakable certainty of my upcoming victory, you have to understand exactly where this specific pen came from. It was not a meaningless luxury gift from a retiring colleague, nor was it a useless decorative trinket purchased in a high-end stationery boutique. 15 years ago, during my peak tenure as a senior investigative actuary, I was assigned to lead a massive, highly classified audit of a major defense contractor. We heavily suspected a sophisticated syndicate of rogue corporate executives was quietly siphoning tens of millions of dollars into untouchable offshore accounts, using perfectly forged procurement contracts and phantom vendor agreements. The internal security division of that defense corporation was quietly run by a brilliant, deeply paranoid former intelligence officer named Arthur. I cannot use his real last name for obvious legal reasons. Arthur and I spent 6 grueling months locked in a windowless, subterranean secure facility, meticulously tearing apart thousands of dense financial documents line by line. We ultimately proved the massive fraud, systematically dismantling their network and sending 3 arrogant senior executives to federal prison for a very long time. On my final day at the secure compound, Arthur pulled me aside and handed me a small, unmarked, velvet-lined box containing this exact fountain pen. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that in his former, highly classified line of work, the most dangerous weapon a man could ever carry was not a loaded firearm. The ultimate weapon was the ability to make a binding, legally devastating agreement completely disappear into thin air. The pen he gifted me was a masterpiece of covert, unregulated chemical engineering. Arthur carefully explained that the ink inside the custom pressurized cartridge was not composed of standard commercial dyes or common synthetic pigments that you would find in any normal office supply store. It was a highly specialized, intensely volatile chemical compound originally developed by intelligence agencies for temporary, high-security field ledgers and classified diplomatic transit documents. When the specialized ink flows from the delicate gold nib and physically bonds with the porous fibers of standard printer paper, it appears as a rich, deeply saturated cobalt blue. It looks incredibly official, entirely permanent, and completely indistinguishable from high-end archival quality ink. It easily passes every standard visual inspection by lawyers, bankers, or real estate brokers. However, the foundational chemical structure of the pigment is deliberately and aggressively unstable. It is scientifically engineered to violently and silently react with the ambient oxygen present in the normal atmosphere. The absolute second the wet ink is exposed to the air in the room, a microscopic, unstoppable chemical countdown instantly begins. Over the precise course of 48 hours, the blue pigment undergoes a rapid, cascading molecular degradation. It literally evaporates into the surrounding air, slowly fading from a dark, confident blue to a pale, watery gray, and finally transitioning to completely transparent. It vanishes without leaving a single visual trace on the surface of the paper. The signature line becomes entirely blank to the naked eye, returning the document to its original, unsigned state. But the ink is not completely gone. The aggressive chemical reaction leaves behind a faint, microscopic crystalline residue embedded deep within the microscopic fibers of the paper itself. This invisible, permanent scar can only be detected under the intense, focused ultraviolet spectrum of a high-powered forensic blacklight. It leaves absolute, undeniable scientific proof of exactly where a signature used to be, providing concrete evidence of intentional document tampering to any judge, jury, or federal investigator who knows exactly what to look for. I rested the smooth gold nib gently against the thick paper of the fraudulent, durable power of attorney document. I took a slow, shallow breath, listening to the heavy, freezing rain violently lashing against the window panes of my study. I felt the immense psychological weight of the moment pressed down firmly on my shoulders. I was not just signing away my house, my investment portfolios, or my life savings. I was intentionally signing the irreversible death warrant for Mark's entire professional and personal existence. I pressed down firmly, feeling the incredibly smooth glide of the metal against the paper. I deliberately wrote my signature slightly slower than I normally would. I ensured my strokes were thick, heavy, and deliberate, allowing a maximum amount of the volatile blue chemical compound to soak deeply into the page. I watched the rich cobalt ink bleed into the fiber, spelling out Daniel Foster in stark, undeniable contrast against the white background. I carefully crossed the letter T and dotted the letter I, letting the pen linger for a fraction of a second to pool the ink. I slowly lifted the pen from the page. I stared down at my name, knowing with absolute scientific certainty that right now the microscopic chemical reaction had already been triggered. The oxygen in my quiet, dimly lit study was already actively attacking the ink, silently chewing away at the binding pigment. I carefully screwed the heavy silver cap back onto the fountain pen, listening for the soft, satisfying click that sealed the nib. I slipped the weapon back into the warm breast pocket of my wool cardigan, crossing my arms over my chest. I then used my index finger to slowly slide the signed, poisoned document across the smooth leather of my desk pad directly toward Mark. His exhausted, bloodshot eyes were entirely fixated on the blue signature. He did not say a single word. He reached out with visibly trembling hands and picked up the piece of paper as if he were holding a priceless religious artifact that had just miraculously saved his soul. He held the document up close to his face, letting the warm light of the brass desk lamp illuminate the signature, inspecting it closely to ensure I had not made any mistakes. A massive, shuddering sigh of profound relief ripped its way out of his chest, echoing loudly in the quiet room. His rigid shoulders instantly dropped, and the manic, terrified energy that had entirely consumed him for the past 48 hours evaporated just as quickly as my signature soon would. He truly believed he had won the ultimate prize. He firmly thought that this single piece of paper was his permanent shield against his aggressive commercial creditors, his golden ticket to unearned millions, and his absolute, tyrannical authority over my entire existence. He carefully placed the lethal document back into his thick manila folder and closed it with a loud, definitive slap of cardboard. The trap was now fully armed, the timer was ticking, and his total destruction was mathematically guaranteed. Friday morning arrived with an unexpected, deceptive brightness. The heavy freezing rain from the previous day had completely cleared, leaving behind a cold, sharp sunlight that streamed through the windows of my home. The oppressive, frantic tension that had choked the house for the past 2 days was suddenly gone. In its place was an eerie, buoyant energy. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, buttoning my sweater, when my bedroom door swung open without a single knock. Sarah practically bounced into the room. She was humming a cheerful, upbeat melody, holding a medium-sized brown canvas suitcase by its worn leather handle. Her face was illuminated by a massive, radiant smile that looked incredibly practiced and entirely artificial. She rolled the suitcase across the carpet and hoisted it onto the mattress next to me. She clapped her hands together lightly and announced that she and Mark had a wonderful, exciting surprise for me. She reached into the back pocket of her jeans and pulled out a glossy, tri-fold paper brochure. She handed it to me with a grand, sweeping gesture. The thick paper felt cold against my fingers. The cover featured a highly edited stock photograph of a smiling, silver-haired couple sitting peacefully on a wooden bench overlooking a pristine blue lake. The bold, elegant letters across the top of the brochure read Oak Creek Wellness Center and Restorative Retreat. Sarah sat down next to me on the bed, her voice dripping with exaggerated sweetness. She told me that she and Mark had noticed how terribly stressed and confused I had been acting lately. She claimed they felt incredibly guilty about not giving me enough attention, so they had pooled their savings to book me an exclusive, weekend-long getaway. She chattered excitedly about the supposed amenities listed in the brochure. She talked about deep tissue massage therapy, guided nature walks through the forest, and a dedicated team of premium medical professionals who would monitor my health and ensure my absolute comfort. She told me a private luxury transport car was scheduled to pick me up tomorrow afternoon. She said the house was going to be professionally deep cleaned while I was gone as an extra surprise, so I needed to be completely out of the way. I looked down at the cheap, glossy paper resting in my hands. The bright stock photos and the elegant typography were a thin, pathetic illusion. The name Oak Creek did not evoke images of serene lakes, gentle massages, or medical luxury in my mind. It evoked a visceral, terrifying memory from my professional past. Exactly 12 years ago, my corporate actuarial firm was urgently contracted by the state government to conduct a massive, highly confidential liability audit. We were brought in to assess the severe financial risks of several state-funded geriatric facilities that were currently facing massive class action lawsuits for criminal negligence. Oak Creek was at the absolute, indisputable top of our highest risk list. I had personally read the unredacted investigative reports. It was not a wellness retreat. It was a notoriously underfunded, heavily overcrowded warehouse for the forgotten and the discarded. It was a grim, concrete facility where the stagnant air permanently smelled of stale urine, boiled cabbage, and strong industrial bleach. The patients there were routinely chemically restrained to keep them quiet, left in soiled bedding for days at a time, and completely stripped of their fundamental human dignity. It was the final, miserable dumping ground for the elderly, who had absolutely no money left, and no family members who cared enough to check on them. The profound, suffocating darkness of their plan finally settled over me in its entirety. This was no longer just a calculated financial plot to steal my house and my money. This was a deliberate, malicious decision to throw me directly into a living nightmare. Mark and Sarah genuinely believed they were about to inherit nearly $3 million based on the fake will I had planted on my desk. They believed they were about to become incredibly wealthy. But even with that massive, fabricated fortune supposedly waiting for them, they still intentionally chose the cheapest, most notoriously abusive state-run facility available in the entire region. They did this simply to maximize their own profit margins, unwilling to spend even a fraction of their stolen money to ensure my basic safety. The sheer, unfathomable cruelty of my own biological daughter sitting next to me, staring at my face with that bright, fake smile, made my stomach violently turn. She was eagerly packing my bags for a prison sentence, fully expecting me to rapidly decline and die in that horrific place so she would never have to deal with the inconvenience of my existence ever again. I did not let a single ounce of that dark, terrifying realization show on my face. I looked up from the glossy brochure and purposefully let my eyes water slightly, manufacturing the exact look of a deeply moved, incredibly grateful old man. I reached out with a trembling hand and gently squeezed her arm. I told her in a soft, breaking voice that she was simply too good to me. I told her I did not deserve such a thoughtful, incredibly expensive gift from my children. Sarah patted my shoulder affectionately, completely buying the pathetic, helpless performance. She let out a soft, condescending laugh and told me not to be silly. She said I deserved the absolute best care in the world after everything I had done for them. She stood up from the bed, unzipped the brown canvas suitcase, and cheerfully walked over to my large wooden dresser to begin packing my things. I sat quietly and watched her methodically empty my drawers. The clothes she selected revealed the absolute truth of her intentions. She did not pack my tailored slacks, my expensive cashmere sweaters, or the high-quality leather walking shoes I normally wore. Instead, she reached into the very back of the closet and pulled out my oldest, most worn-out garments. She packed faded, oversized flannel shirts, thin cotton sweatpants with frayed hems, and a pair of heavily scuffed, worn-out slippers. She was not packing the wardrobe of a wealthy man heading to an exclusive luxury retreat. She was deliberately packing the pathetic, easily disposable wardrobe of a ward of the state. She was packing the exact clothes they would eventually dress my corpse in when the facility finally called to inform them of my passing. I played along enthusiastically, refusing to break character for a single second. I stood up, walked slowly over to the closet, and pulled out a thick, heavy woolen scarf. I handed it to her, telling her the brochure mentioned the night air by the lake might get quite chilly, and I wanted to be prepared. I watched her take the scarf, fold it quickly without looking at me, and aggressively shove it into the corner of the canvas bag. Every single item she packed was another nail she truly thought she was driving into my coffin. She zipped the heavy suitcase closed with a loud, metallic sound that echoed in the quiet bedroom. She lifted the bag and placed it neatly by the bedroom door, ensuring it was entirely out of the way. She turned back to me, placing her hands on her hips, and instructed me to get plenty of rest tonight. She said tomorrow was going to be a very big, very important day for all of us, and she wanted me to be completely relaxed for the long drive. I nodded slowly, offering her another weak, grateful smile. I agreed with her completely, though our internal definitions of a big day were drastically, violently different. She wished me a good morning and left the room, pulling the door shut firmly behind her. I stood completely alone in the center of my bedroom, staring coldly at the packed brown suitcase resting against the wall. They had meticulously planned my complete physical erasure for tomorrow afternoon. But I knew a crucial, devastating piece of information they did not. I knew they had scheduled a high-end real estate broker to come to the house tomorrow at exactly noon to sign the official listing agreement. They confidently assumed I would be quietly sitting upstairs in my room, waiting like an obedient dog for the state transport van to arrive and take me to hell. They had absolutely no idea that tomorrow afternoon, the specialized blue ink on the forged power of attorney would completely vanish into thin air. They had no idea my ruthless attorney would be standing right in the middle of my living room. I turned away from the suitcase and walked toward the window to look out at the cold winter sun. The trap I had spent the entire week meticulously building was finally armed, and tomorrow, it was going to snap shut with enough force to shatter their entire world. Saturday afternoon arrived with a crisp and clear winter sky that completely belied the dark, treacherous atmosphere inside my home. I was standing perfectly still inside my bedroom with the door firmly closed. I was definitely not wearing the faded sweatpants and the worn-out slippers that Sarah had so eagerly packed for me yesterday. I was dressed in a meticulously tailored dark charcoal wool suit. I wore a crisp white dress shirt and a burgundy silk tie, perfectly knotted at my collar. I looked exactly like the senior corporate actuary I had been for 40 years. I looked like a man who commanded boardrooms and dismantled complex financial frauds for a living. Downstairs, the house was buzzing with a disgusting level of excited energy. Sarah was practically humming a cheerful tune as she arranged a platter of expensive artisanal cheeses and poured sparkling mineral water into crystal glasses in the kitchen. Mark was pacing the living room floor. He was not walking with the frantic and terrified energy of a man facing imminent bankruptcy from aggressive commercial creditors. He was walking with the slow and arrogant strut of a conquering king who had just seized a massive new territory. They were happily setting the stage for their grand financial triumph. The antique wall clock in the hallway chimed 11:30. They firmly believed that I was currently lying in my bed upstairs, just waiting for the bleak state transport van to arrive at 2 o'clock to take me to the Oak Creek facility. They had absolutely no idea that I was fully dressed and completely ready for war. At precisely noon, a heavy, confident knock echoed through the grand foyer. I cracked my bedroom door open just a fraction of an inch to listen to the performance. I heard the heavy front door swing open, and Sarah let out a loud, theatrical gasp of pure delight. She welcomed the guest with an overwhelming and entirely artificial warmth. The woman who entered the house introduced herself as Victoria. Her expensive heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor with an air of absolute authority. Victoria was a high-end luxury real estate broker known for handling the most exclusive residential properties in the entire county. I had seen her glossy, full-page advertisements in the local financial magazines for years. Mark immediately took over the conversation from his wife. His voice boomed through the hallway, dripping with a sickening level of forced confidence. He offered Victoria a glass of sparkling water and immediately began bragging about the massive square footage of the property. He pointed out the imported marble countertops in the kitchen and the custom oak paneling in my private study. He spoke about my home as if he had built it from the ground up with his own two hands, instead of simply squatting in it, rent-free for the past year. They began walking Victoria through the first floor to give her the grand tour. I stepped silently out of my bedroom and stood at the very top of the grand staircase, hidden entirely by the deep shadows of the second-floor landing. I could hear every single spoken word with absolute clarity. Victoria complimented the stunning architecture and the massive amount of natural light flooding into the main living room. Sarah laughed lightly. It was a high tinkling sound that made my jaw clench tight. She told Victoria that the house had wonderful bones, but it desperately needed a modern and youthful touch. She casually mentioned that the previous owner simply had absolutely no taste for contemporary design. She referred to me in the past tense as if I were already dead and buried in the ground. Mark quickly chimed in to assure the broker that the house would be completely empty and professionally deep-cleaned by Monday morning. He stated firmly that all the old depressing antique furniture would be hauled away to the local dump by a junk removal service. He was talking about the beautiful hand-carved mahogany dining table Patricia and I had saved up for years to buy on our 10th wedding anniversary. He was talking about effortlessly erasing my entire personal history simply to make the staging process easier for their upcoming open house. They eventually settled back into the living room and sat down heavily on the plush leather sofas. I crept a few steps lower on the carpeted stairs to ensure I did not miss a single detail of their shared financial delusion. Victoria opened her heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of glossy market analysis reports. She told Mark and Sarah that the current market for homes in this specific upscale neighborhood was incredibly aggressive. She confirmed that the initial bank appraisal of $1.2 million was actually quite conservative. She confidently predicted that with the right professional staging and a massive weekend open house event, they could easily trigger a vicious bidding war. She said that bidding war would likely push the final cash sale price well over $1.4 million. I heard Mark let out a low, breathy whistle of pure greed. He leaned back comfortably in his chair, letting the expensive leather creak loudly under his weight. He told Victoria that a fast cash sale sounded absolutely perfect for his current investment strategy. He arrogantly explained that he was looking to aggressively liquidate this specific real estate asset as quickly as possible to fund a massive nationwide expansion of his commercial logistics company. He was lying through his teeth with breathtaking ease. He was pretending to be a brilliant, successful business tycoon rather than a desperate, failing fraudster who was actively dodging ruthless debt collection agencies. Sarah clapped her hands together softly in sheer delight. She asked Victoria how quickly they could get the official property listing live on the global real estate networks. Victoria assured them that as soon as the exclusive listing agreement was signed today, her professional photography team would be at the house tomorrow morning. She promised the property would be actively marketed to wealthy international buyers by Monday evening. The sheer blinding greed radiating in that room was almost thick enough to physically touch. Mark and Sarah had completely bought into their own twisted and malicious fantasy. They truly thought they had perfectly committed the ultimate flawless crime against their own family. They firmly believed they had successfully silenced the inconvenient old man. They believed they had safely secured the forged legal authority through the fake power of attorney document. They were now mere minutes away from signing the binding paperwork that would officially turn my decades of hard work into their personal lottery ticket. They were absolutely drunk on the intoxicating illusion of their impending victory. They were so incredibly focused on the imaginary millions of dollars dancing in their heads that they completely failed to notice the subtle creak of the floorboards above them. They did not realize that the helpless and senile victim they thought they had so easily discarded was currently walking down the grand staircase. They had absolutely no idea that their illusion was about to be violently shattered. I placed my right foot on the first wooden step of the grand staircase. I did not try to muffle the sound. I brought my polished leather Oxford shoe down with a sharp and heavy thud that echoed like a gunshot through the high ceilings of the foyer. In the living room, the excited and rapid-fire chatter about cash offers and bidding wars stopped instantly. The sudden silence was absolute and incredibly heavy. I took another step. The rhythmic and commanding sound of my descent forced them to turn their heads toward the staircase. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, with my shoulders pulled back and my chin raised high. I was not leaning heavily on the wooden banister. I was not shuffling my feet or trembling. I descended those stairs with the exact same dominant and calculated stride I used when entering a hostile corporate boardroom to dismantle a corrupt executive team. When I reached the mid-level landing, the bright afternoon sunlight streaming from the massive foyer window caught the sharp lines of my dark charcoal wool suit. I paused for a single second, allowing them to fully absorb the visual reality of my transformation. Mark and Sarah were sitting on the plush leather sofa, frozen like statues. Their eyes were wide and completely devoid of the arrogant, predatory gleam they possessed just moments ago. Sarah let out a small, breathless gasp. Her hands involuntarily flew up to cover her mouth. She was staring directly at the burgundy silk tie, perfectly knotted at my collar. She suddenly remembered the faded, pathetic sweatpants and the moth-eaten flannel shirts she had so gleefully packed into my brown canvas suitcase yesterday. The cognitive dissonance was hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The helpless and confused victim she had completely written off was currently standing above her, radiating an aura of absolute and terrifying authority. Mark jumped to his feet, his face drained of all color, turning a sickly and pale shade of gray. His jaw worked silently for a few seconds before he finally managed to push words out of his throat. He tried to fall back on the condescending and fake caregiver persona he had utilized all week. He forced a highly unnatural and nervous laugh that completely failed to hide the rising panic in his chest. He took a hesitant step toward the bottom of the stairs, raising his hands in a placating gesture. He asked me what in the world I was doing out of bed dressed like that. He told me I was supposed to be resting upstairs before the transport van arrived to take me to the wellness retreat. His voice was shaky and completely lacking the booming confidence he had just used to impress the real estate broker. He desperately tried to signal Victoria with his eyes, attempting to dismiss my appearance as a random and confusing episode of a senile old man playing dress-up. I ignored his pathetic attempt entirely. I finished my descent, stepping off the final stair and walking directly into the center of the living room. I did not shuffle or hesitate. I moved with a cold and fluid purpose. I looked directly past Mark and focused my absolute attention on the luxury real estate broker. Victoria was standing near the fireplace, clutching her glossy market analysis reports tightly against her chest. She looked profoundly confused and highly alert. She had been explicitly told that the owner of the property was a rapidly declining and legally incompetent man who was completely unaware of his surroundings. The man currently standing in front of her was razor-sharp and immaculately groomed, while staring at her with the cold and assessing eyes of a veteran auditor. I extended my hand toward her. I spoke in a deep, booming, and completely steady voice that I had not used in over a year. I formally introduced myself as Daniel Foster, the sole owner of the property she was currently evaluating. I thanked her for taking the time out of her busy Saturday schedule to visit my home, but I informed her that she had been brought here under highly fraudulent pretenses. Victoria slowly reached out and shook my hand. Her grip was firm, but I could feel the slight hesitation in her fingers. She looked rapidly back and forth between my tailored suit and Mark, with his terrified and sweating face. She realized instantly that she had unwittingly stepped directly into a highly volatile and deeply dangerous family war zone. Mark lunged forward desperately, trying to intercept the conversation and regain control of the room. He raised his voice, attempting to shout over me. He aggressively told Victoria to ignore everything I was saying. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and loudly declared that I was suffering from severe dementia and having a massive delusional episode. He insisted that he was the legally appointed agent in charge of the estate and that the sale was moving forward exactly as planned. He was practically hyperventilating and entirely blinded by his desperate need to secure the listing agreement today. He thought if he just shouted loud enough, he could somehow force the reality of the situation back into the twisted and fraudulent shape he wanted. He was entirely wrong. Before Victoria could respond to his frantic shouting, the heavy wooden door leading from the kitchen to the dining room swung open with a smooth and silent glide. Bradley Walsh stepped out from the shadows of the hallway and walked deliberately into the bright living room. I had left the back patio door unlocked for him exactly an hour ago. He did not look like a friendly neighborhood lawyer dropping by for a casual visit. He looked like an apex predator entering a hunting ground. He was wearing a sharp navy blue pinstripe suit, with his silver hair perfectly styled and his expression carved from solid granite. He carried a massive and thick black leather briefcase in his right hand. The immediate atmospheric shift in the living room was profound and completely suffocating. Mark stopped shouting instantly. His mouth hung open, and his eyes darted frantically between my calm and dominant stance and the intimidating presence of the man who had just silently flanked him. Sarah shrank back deeply into the cushions of the leather sofa, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, as if trying to physically protect herself from the sudden and overwhelming danger. Bradley walked slowly over to the heavy mahogany coffee table located right in the middle of the seating arrangement. He did not say a single word of greeting to anyone. He placed his heavy leather briefcase down onto the polished wood. The two solid brass locks on the briefcase snapped open with a sharp and synchronized metallic click that sounded incredibly loud in the dead silence of the room. The ambush was now perfectly executed. The predators who thought they controlled the narrative had just realized they were entirely surrounded and completely unarmed while standing directly in the center of an inescapable trap. The heavy metallic click of Bradley unlocking his leather briefcase seemed to finally break the spell of absolute paralysis that had gripped my son-in-law. Mark blinked rapidly, shaking his head as if trying to physically dislodge the terrifying reality that was currently unfolding in the center of the living room. He realized that the silent intimidation tactic was failing miserably, so he immediately resorted to the only defense mechanism he had left, which was loud, aggressive arrogance. He puffed out his chest and took a heavy step forward, intentionally placing himself directly between the luxury real estate broker and myself. He raised his chin, attempting to look down at me, completely ignoring the imposing presence of the former federal prosecutor standing just a few feet away. Mark let out a harsh, barking laugh that contained absolutely no genuine humor. He turned his head slightly to address Victoria, using a deeply patronizing tone. He told her she would have to forgive the sudden theatrical interruption. He claimed that my severe cognitive decline often manifested as extreme paranoia and completely fabricated delusions of grandeur. He insisted that I frequently hired random people to act as lawyers or financial advisors in my twisted, senile fantasies. He was trying to construct a desperate narrative to save the lucrative real estate deal, painting me as a tragic, confused victim of a rotting brain rather than the architect of his impending destruction. Victoria did not look convinced. She was a woman who had survived decades in the cutthroat world of high-end real estate, and she possessed a highly refined instinct for spotting desperate liars. She took a slow, measured step backward, creating a safe physical distance from Mark. She clutched her glossy market analysis folders tightly against her chest, her eyes darting between my perfectly calm demeanor, Bradley staring with cold precision, and Mark standing there with a profusely sweating face. Mark recognized her hesitation instantly, and it sent a fresh wave of blinding panic through his veins. He knew he was rapidly losing control of the room, and he needed to deploy his ultimate weapon immediately. He aggressively marched over to the wooden console table near the entryway where he had left his own leather satchel. He ripped the satchel open with such violent force that the metal zipper audibly ground against the fabric. He was breathing heavily, muttering under his breath about the absolute absurdity of this entire situation. He reached deep into the bag and pulled out the thick manila folder. It was the exact same folder he had shoved in my face 2 days ago under the guise of an urgent medical insurance update. He turned back around to face the room, holding the cardboard folder aloft as if it were an indestructible shield of solid iron. Mark slapped the folder hard against the palm of his other hand, using the loud smacking sound to demand the attention of everyone in the room. He looked directly at Victoria, completely ignoring me and my attorney. He raised his voice to a booming, authoritative volume, desperately trying to project the image of a man in total legal control. He told the broker that she did not need to worry about any of the insane ramblings coming from my mouth. He proudly declared that he held the sole, comprehensive, and legally binding durable power of attorney over my entire estate. He claimed the document had been reviewed by his own legal team and was officially signed and executed just 48 hours ago. He stated with absolute, unwavering confidence that this single piece of paper granted him the unhindered right to sign the exclusive property listing agreement today, to approve the final cash sale, and to completely liquidate the house regardless of any objections I might suddenly invent. He was smiling again, a wide, deeply arrogant smirk that stretched across his sweating face. He truly believed he possessed the ultimate trump card. He thought he could simply wave a piece of paper in the air and magically force the reality of his massive fraud into existence. He was so thoroughly blinded by his own greed and his desperate need to pay off his commercial creditors that he completely failed to notice the profound, knowing silence coming from my side of the room. Bradley and I did not try to interrupt his passionate, desperate speech. We simply stood together and watched him eagerly climb the steps to his own gallows. Mark confidently walked over to the mahogany coffee table, standing directly opposite from Bradley. He threw the thick manila folder down onto the polished wood with an aggressive, dramatic flourish. He placed his large hands on the cardboard cover and slowly opened the flap. The tension in the living room was so incredibly thick, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. I watched his fingers flip past the first 2 pages of the standard medical privacy disclosures. He was moving with the agonizing slowness of a man who fully expects to be crowned a king in the very next second. He finally reached the 3rd page. This was the specific document, the fraudulent power of attorney, the absolute foundation of his entire criminal enterprise. He firmly grasped the top edge of the paper and smoothly pulled it out from under the stack, laying it flat on the table for the real estate broker to inspect. He did not even bother to look down at it himself at first. He kept his eyes locked onto Victoria, waiting for her to read the dense legal text and acknowledge his absolute authority. But Victoria did not nod in agreement. She did not reach for her pen to finalize the real estate contract. She simply stared down at the piece of paper on the table, her perfectly manicured eyebrows drawing together in deep, profound confusion. Mark finally followed her gaze. He lowered his eyes to the bottom of the page, expecting to see the rich, dark, cobalt blue ink spelling out my legal name on the signature line. He expected to see the permanent, undeniable proof of his victory. Instead, he saw absolutely nothing. The signature line was completely and entirely blank. The volatile chemical compound inside the specialized intelligence pen I had used 2 days ago had functioned with absolute, devastating perfection. The aggressive oxidation process had completely evaporated every single microscopic trace of the blue pigment into the surrounding air. The paper was as pristine and empty as the day it was printed. The arrogant smirk on Mark's face did not simply fade away. It violently shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. His jaw dropped open, leaving his mouth hanging in a silent, grotesque circle of pure horror. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. He let out a low, strangled, gasping sound, as if an invisible hand had just forcefully crushed his windpipe. He frantically grabbed the piece of paper with both hands, lifting it mere inches from his face, his bloodshot eyes bulging from their sockets as he desperately searched for any faint trace of the blue ink. He aggressively rubbed his thumb over the empty line, absurdly hoping he could somehow wipe away the blankness and uncover the signature hiding underneath. He forcefully flipped the page over, checking the completely blank backside, before flipping it over again. His hands were shaking so violently that the thick paper rattled loudly in the quiet room. The invincible legal shield he had just proudly bragged about, to a prominent local professional, was nothing more than a worthless, completely empty piece of paper. Victoria observed his complete mental and physical collapse with the cold, calculating eyes of a veteran businesswoman. Her initial confusion instantly evaporated, rapidly replaced by a deep, highly offended professional suspicion. She took another deliberate step back, physically distancing herself from the mahogany coffee table and the frantic, hyperventilating man standing over it. She realized with absolute clarity that the arrogant man who had just promised her a lucrative, multi-million-dollar listing was currently holding a completely blank document while desperately claiming it granted him total legal authority over another man's estate. The severe legal implications of the situation crashed over her. She knew that participating in the sale of a property under fraudulent pretenses could result in the immediate and permanent revocation of her highly coveted real estate license, not to mention the massive federal criminal charges for wire fraud and conspiracy. She looked directly at Mark, her voice dropping to a harsh, demanding whisper. She asked him exactly what kind of sick, twisted game he was trying to play with her professional reputation. She stated firmly that there was absolutely no signature on that document, and therefore he had zero legal standing to even discuss the sale of this property, let alone sign a binding listing agreement. She tightly gripped her leather briefcase, her entire posture shifting into a defensive, highly aggressive stance. The luxurious, profitable business transaction she thought she was securing had just morphed into a massive, terrifying liability. Mark was completely paralyzed. He stood there trembling, clutching the blank piece of paper, entirely unable to form a single coherent word to explain the impossible, terrifying reality he was currently holding in his hands. The profound silence in the living room was suddenly broken by the deep, resonant voice of Bradley Walsh. He did not yell or raise his voice to compete with the panicked energy radiating from my son-in-law. He simply spoke with the crushing absolute authority of a man who had spent his entire career sending arrogant criminals to federal prison. He stepped away from his open leather briefcase and walked directly toward the luxury real estate broker. He completely ignored Mark, who was still standing frozen by the coffee table, staring down at the completely blank piece of paper in his trembling hands. Bradley extended his hand to Victoria and formally introduced himself as the senior managing partner of Walsh & Associates and the primary legal counsel for Daniel Foster. Victoria shook his hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of deep professional relief and rising personal anger. She knew immediately that Bradley was the only person in the room offering her the actual truth. Bradley turned his body slightly so he could address both Victoria and the two terrified scavengers cowering in my living room. He kept his tone perfectly even and terrifyingly polite. He told Victoria that he sincerely apologized for the highly unprofessional and deeply disturbing situation she had been dragged into today. He explained that she had been lured to this property under entirely false pretenses by two desperate individuals who were actively attempting to commit a massive coordinated real estate fraud. Mark finally found his voice. He dropped the blank piece of paper onto the coffee table and took a threatening step toward my attorney. He shouted that Bradley was lying and that he still had the legal right to sell the house because he was my family. Bradley did not even flinch. He did not take a single step back. He simply slowly turned his head and locked his cold, predatory eyes directly onto Mark. The sheer intensity of the former federal prosecutor hit Mark like a physical wall, stopping him dead in his tracks. Bradley calmly instructed Mark to remain absolutely silent unless he wanted to be immediately detained for felony document forgery and attempted wire fraud. Mark swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. He took a slow, cowardly step backward, bumping into the leather sofa where Sarah was currently sitting, frozen in terror. Bradley turned his attention back to his open briefcase. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of documents bound by a thick blue legal ribbon. The top page featured the raised golden seal of the county clerk office. Bradley placed the heavy stack of official documents directly onto the coffee table right next to the worthless blank paper Mark had tried to use. He looked at Victoria and told her that he wanted to ensure her professional reputation remained entirely spotless, so he was going to show her exactly who owned the ground they were currently standing on. Bradley carefully untied the blue ribbon and spread the official county property records across the polished wood. He pointed a steady finger at the highly detailed deed transfer forms that we had executed perfectly just a few days prior. He explained to Victoria with absolute clinical precision that Daniel Foster was no longer the legal owner of this $1.2 million estate. He stated clearly that as of Thursday afternoon, the entire property and all associated physical assets had been legally and permanently transferred into an irrevocable blind trust. He paused for a moment, allowing the heavy legal term to fully sink into the minds of everyone in the room. He looked directly at Sarah, whose eyes were currently welling up with tears of absolute panic. He explained that an irrevocable trust is a permanent titanium vault. He stated that the moment I signed those transfer documents, I voluntarily surrendered all personal ownership of the house. The property now legally belonged entirely to the Foster Family Trust, which was an independent corporate entity managed exclusively by his downtown law firm. The color completely drained from the face of my daughter. She let out a soft, pathetic whimper, finally understanding the massive, catastrophic scale of the trap they had blindly walked into. Bradley continued his brutal legal execution without a single ounce of mercy. He looked back at Mark and delivered the final crushing blow. He explained that because Daniel Foster did not own the house, absolutely no power of attorney document in the world could ever authorize its sale. He told Mark that even if the fraudulent piece of paper he brought to the table today had been signed in permanent black ink, it would be entirely and laughably useless. You cannot legally sell a house that the principal assigner does not actually own. Bradley told Victoria that Mark and Sarah were not the legal agents of the estate. He stated firmly that in the eyes of the law, they were absolutely nothing more than unauthorized tenants currently squatting inside a property owned by a highly aggressive corporate law firm. Victoria listened to every single word with absolute rapt attention. She leaned forward and quickly inspected the raised golden seals and the official timestamps on the county deed transfers. She was a highly experienced broker, and she instantly recognized ironclad, bulletproof legal documentation when she saw it. When she fully comprehended the massive scale of the crime, she had almost been made an accessory to her professional demeanor, completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a deep burning and highly explosive disgust. She realized that these two arrogant people had happily wasted her valuable weekend and had actively tried to trick her into participating in a federal crime that would have permanently destroyed her entire career and likely sent her to prison. Victoria aggressively snatched her glossy market analysis reports off the coffee table. She shoved them violently into her expensive leather briefcase, closing it with a loud, angry snap. She turned entirely around to face Mark and Sarah. She did not bother to hide her absolute contempt. She looked Mark up and down, taking in his sweating face, his untucked dress shirt, and his desperate, pathetic posture. She spoke in a sharp, biting tone that cut through the room like a serrated knife. She told Mark that in her 20 years of selling luxury real estate, she had met incredibly wealthy people, and she had met incredibly desperate people. She told him he was the most pathetic combination of both she had ever encountered. She stated loudly that he was a cheap, clumsy fraud who did not have the intelligence to pull off the crime he had so arrogantly planned. Sarah tried to stand up from the leather sofa. She reached her shaking hand out toward the broker and tried to speak. She desperately tried to apologize, claiming they just had a terrible misunderstanding about the medical paperwork. Victoria did not even let her finish the sentence. She held up her hand, silencing my daughter instantly. She looked at Sarah with eyes full of absolute venom. She told Sarah that attempting to steal a home from her own father by faking his mental decline was the most disgusting and evil thing she had ever witnessed in her entire life. She advised them both to hire a very good criminal defense attorney because she was going straight to her car to call the State Real Estate Commission and report this entire attempted fraud immediately. Victoria did not wait for a single word of response. She turned sharply on her expensive heels and marched directly toward the grand foyer. She did not look back. She grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door, pulled it open, and walked out into the cold afternoon air. She slammed the door shut behind her with such incredible force that the antique mirror hanging on the hallway wall violently rattled against the plaster. The loud slam echoed through the entire house, leaving behind a crushing and absolute silence. The illusion of their grand victory had not just been broken. It had been systematically dismantled, crushed into dust, and scattered to the wind. Mark and Sarah were left standing in the center of the living room, completely exposed, stripped of all their arrogant lies and entirely defenseless against the man they had so foolishly tried to destroy. The legal hammer had officially dropped, and the impact was absolutely devastating. The heavy echo of the front door slamming shut hung in the air for a long, uncomfortable minute. Mark and Sarah stood completely frozen in the center of the living room. Their grand illusion of wealth and total control had just walked out the door, leaving them entirely exposed. Sarah was the first to break the suffocating silence. Her initial shock rapidly morphed into a hysterical and desperate rage. She pointed a shaking finger directly at me and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She yelled that I was completely out of my mind and that I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. She turned her furious attention to Bradley and frantically accused him of being a predatory lawyer who was actively exploiting a severely declining old man. She shrieked that her father was suffering from advanced dementia, and that I had absolutely no legal capacity to create an irrevocable trust or transfer any property deeds. She desperately tried to cling to the fake narrative they had spent weeks building in the shadows. She claimed they had a respected medical professional examine me just yesterday morning who confirmed my severe cognitive impairment. She yelled that they were simply trying to protect me from myself by sending me to a secure medical facility where I could not wander off or hurt anyone. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings, sounding shrill and entirely pathetic. She truly believed that if she just screamed the word dementia loudly enough, she could somehow invalidate the ironclad legal fortress we had just revealed. Bradley did not raise his voice to match her hysterical shouting. He simply stood there with his hands clasped casually in front of him and let her scream until she finally ran out of breath. When she stood there panting heavily, with tears of furious panic streaming down her face, he slowly reached his hand back into his open leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick, securely bound folder containing the official documentation from the Apex Neurological Institute. He lifted the heavy folder high into the air and then brought it down onto the solid mahogany coffee table with a massive resounding crack. The sharp noise made Sarah physically jump backward. Bradley looked at her with a chilling combination of pity and intense professional disgust. He calmly informed her that the man she had brought into this house yesterday morning was nothing more than a cheap, hired actor masquerading as a medical professional. He told her that immediately after her pathetic little charade, I had taken a private car directly to the most prestigious diagnostic clinic in the entire state. He instructed Sarah to look down at the heavy stack of papers resting on the table. He explicitly detailed how I had voluntarily subjected myself to a grueling 3-hour cognitive evaluation conducted by 2 independent board-certified senior neurologists. He stated clearly that those doctors had pushed my brain to its absolute limits, testing my executive function, memory retention, and complex logical reasoning. He pointed to the thick, raised notary seals stamped on the final page of the report. He told Sarah the medical conclusion was entirely undeniable. The report legally certified that my cognitive function was not just perfectly normal, but actually operating at the level of a highly educated professional in his absolute prime. Bradley looked directly into her terrified eyes and told her that any claim of mental incompetence was scientifically impossible and medically fraudulent. Sarah collapsed entirely onto the leather sofa, burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly. The medical foundation of their sinister plot was completely obliterated. Mark realized his wife had entirely given up. He frantically tried to salvage whatever tiny fragment of control he could find. He raised his hands defensively and tried to force a pathetic, pleading smile onto his sweating face. He stammered that this was all just a massive misunderstanding. He claimed he only forged the power of attorney because he was desperately trying to help manage the overwhelming household bills. He lied and said he never intended to steal the house but was only trying to secure a small short-term loan to keep his logistics business afloat so he could continue providing for the family. He begged Bradley to just tear up the legal paperwork and let us handle this terrible miscommunication privately as a family. He said we did not need to involve any authorities or ruin the beautiful relationship we had built over the years. Bradley let out a low, dark chuckle that completely lacked any warmth. He told Mark that his sudden desire for family privacy was incredibly convenient, but ultimately far too late. Bradley reached into his briefcase for the third and final time. He pulled out a slim red folder that looked distinctly different from the property deeds and the medical reports. He tossed the red folder onto the coffee table right next to the blank power of attorney document. It landed with a soft but terrifying thud. Bradley looked at Mark with the cold, unforgiving eyes of a prosecutor who had just cornered his primary target. He told Mark that the red folder contained a highly detailed, comprehensive forensic accounting report. He stated that my decades of experience as a senior corporate actuary made me exceptionally skilled at tracking stolen money and identifying hidden financial liabilities. Bradley carefully opened the red folder and began listing the devastating facts. He stated that exactly 3 weeks ago, Mark had utilized my highly sensitive personal information, including my private social security number, to fraudulently open a massive commercial line of credit. He clearly articulated the exact sum of $40,000 that had been illegally funneled directly into the failing business accounts of his logistics company. Bradley watched the remaining color completely drain from the face of my son-in-law as he systematically listed the specific federal statutes Mark had knowingly violated. He calmly named aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and interstate financial conspiracy. He told Mark that these were not simple misunderstandings or minor civil disputes that could be brushed under the rug. He stated with absolute certainty that these were massive federal felonies carrying mandatory minimum prison sentences. Bradley explained that the evidence was completely bulletproof, consisting of time-stamped digital Internet Protocol addresses, forged electronic signatures, and direct bank transfer receipts, tying Mark directly to the stolen funds. He told Mark that the authorities would not need to conduct a lengthy investigation because we had already done all the forensic work for them. The absolute reality of their destruction finally crashed down upon them with the crushing weight of a collapsing building. Mark felt his knees visibly buckle, and he stumbled backward, falling heavily into a wooden armchair. His eyes were wide and completely vacant, staring blankly at the red folder resting on the coffee table. He finally realized he was not a brilliant businessman securing a multi-million-dollar inheritance. He was a pathetic, exposed criminal who was now millions of dollars in debt, completely homeless, and staring directly down the barrel of a federal indictment. Sarah had stopped sobbing. She sat frozen on the sofa, staring at her husband in absolute horror, finally realizing the massive criminal liability he had secretly dragged her into. They had spent the entire week arrogantly planning my complete physical and financial erasure. They had laughed about dumping me in a state-run nightmare facility while they eagerly counted their stolen millions. Now they were sitting in a house they no longer owned, staring at undeniable medical proof of my sharp intellect and facing a mountain of forensic evidence documenting their massive federal crimes. The predators had been entirely stripped of their fangs and their claws. They were now completely at my mercy, and they knew with absolute terrifying certainty that the man standing before them possessed absolutely none. I stepped forward, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the living room. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. When you hold the absolute power to destroy a person's life, you do not need to shout. I looked down at Mark, who was still slumped in the wooden armchair, and then over to Sarah, who was completely paralyzed on the leather sofa. I told them that the time for apologies and pathetic excuses had officially expired. I explained that I was not a judge or a federal jury, but I was the man who currently held their entire future inside a thin red folder. I told them I was going to offer them a single final choice, and they were going to make their decision immediately. I wanted them to understand that this was not a negotiation. It was an absolute dictate. I laid out the terms of my ultimatum with cold and calculated precision. I told them option 1 was incredibly simple, but entirely devastating. They were going to stand up and walk out of my front door right this very second. I stated firmly that they were not allowed to go upstairs to pack their bags or gather their personal belongings. They were not permitted to take the expensive jewelry they had secretly bought using the credit cards they opened in my name. They were not even allowed to take the luxury vehicles parked out in my driveway, because I had personally paid off those massive car loans just last year when I foolishly thought I was helping my struggling family. I told them they would leave this property with absolutely nothing but the clothes currently on their backs. I demanded that they drop their house keys and their garage door openers directly onto the floor. Furthermore, they were to never step foot on my property or attempt to contact me ever again. If they chose this option, I would allow them to walk away and attempt to survive the massive commercial debt they had created for themselves without my money to save them. They would walk away as absolute beggars. Then I calmly explained option 2. I gestured toward Bradley, who was standing perfectly still beside the mahogany coffee table. I told Mark and Sarah that my attorney had taken the liberty of contacting the local law enforcement authorities before he even arrived at my house this afternoon. I informed them that there were currently 2 police cruisers parked quietly just out of sight at the end of our block. The officers inside were fully briefed and waiting for a signal. If they hesitated for even a single moment, or tried to argue about the strict terms of their departure, Bradley would simply pick up his smartphone and make a 10-second call. I told Mark that the police would walk straight through my front door, place him in heavy steel handcuffs, and formally arrest him for multiple counts of federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. I looked directly at Sarah and told her they would likely arrest her right alongside him as a willing accomplice to a massive conspiracy to commit severe elder abuse and medical fraud. I told her the state prosecutors would ensure she spent the best years of her life in a cold, concrete cell instead of the luxury wellness retreat she had so maliciously planned for my demise. I reached into the pocket of my suit trousers and pulled out my grandfather's gold pocket watch. It was the exact same watch Sarah had mockingly told the fake doctor I had lost decades ago. I held it up high so they could clearly see the polished metal gleaming in the afternoon light. I pressed the top button, and the loud rhythmic ticking sound began to echo ominously in the silent room. I told them they had exactly 5 minutes to get off my property before Bradley made the phone call that would end their freedom permanently. Mark stared at the ticking watch and then at the red folder resting on the table. He knew I was entirely serious. He knew the forensic evidence was absolutely undeniable and completely inescapable. The sheer terrifying reality of spending decades in a federal penitentiary finally overpowered his deeply ingrained arrogant greed. He scrambled frantically out of the wooden chair so fast he nearly tripped over his own expensive leather shoes. Sarah sat frozen, realizing that her husband, the man who had promised her millions of dollars, was now abandoning her to save himself. She looked at me with pleading eyes, hoping to find a shred of the gentle father she had manipulated for years. She found absolutely nothing but a cold, impenetrable wall. I simply tapped the glass face of the gold watch and told her the first minute had already passed. The loud, rhythmic ticking of the gold pocket watch was the only sound in the room for a long, agonizing moment. Mark stared at the shiny metal casing as if it were a bomb counting down to his absolute destruction. The sheer terror of federal prison finally snapped whatever tiny thread of loyalty he held for his wife. He spun around and pointed a trembling finger directly at Sarah. His voice was high-pitched and thick with desperate panic. He loudly declared that the entire horrific plan was her idea from the very beginning. He told Bradley that he was just a desperate husband trying to keep his failing business afloat, and that Sarah was the one who desperately wanted to steal the house. He claimed she constantly complained about how much she hated taking care of an old man, and that she was the one who researched the state-run facility. He threw the woman he married completely under the bus without a single second of hesitation, desperately hoping to trade her freedom for his own. Sarah stared at her husband with wide, horrified eyes. The ultimate betrayal completely shattered her remaining composure. She realized the man she had conspired with was now actively trying to send her to a concrete cell. She turned away from Mark and threw herself off the leather sofa, falling heavily to her knees on the hardwood floor. She crawled a few inches toward me, reaching her shaking hands out to grasp the hem of my tailored suit trousers. I took a deliberate step back, refusing to let her touch me. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. These were not the fake theatrical tears she had used with the fake doctor. These were tears of pure, unadulterated terror. She sobbed violently, begging me to listen to her. She cried out that Mark was a manipulative monster who had forced her into this terrible situation. She pleaded for my mercy, swearing on her life that she loved me, and that she would spend the rest of her days making it up to me if I just let them stay. She begged her daddy to please forgive his only little girl. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping woman kneeling on my floor. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep well of paternal love I had carried for her entire life had been completely drained and permanently sealed. I leaned down slightly, keeping my posture rigidly straight. I spoke in a voice so quiet and so cold that it instantly froze the tears on her face. I told her that I knew exactly whose idea it was because I had known every single detail of their disgusting plan since Tuesday evening. Sarah stopped sobbing. Her breath hitched in her throat as a new wave of profound confusion and horror washed over her. I looked directly into her eyes and recited the exact words that had been permanently burned into my memory. I spoke slowly, enunciating every single syllable with absolute clarity. I said the appraisal came in at $1.2 million, and we just need the doctor to sign the dementia paperwork on Friday so we can dump him at the Oak Creek facility and list the house. Sarah let out a soft, terrified gasp. The remaining color completely vanished from her face. She realized instantly that I had seen the text message on her locked phone screen in the kitchen while making tea. She finally understood that for the entire week, while they were arrogantly plotting my demise, I had been silently watching their every move and meticulously engineering their total destruction. I stood back up to my full height and looked at the gold pocket watch resting in my palm. I told them that their pathetic display of betrayal and begging had just cost them 3 very valuable minutes. I closed the metal casing of the watch with a loud, sharp click. I told them they had exactly 60 seconds left to walk out of my front door, or they would be leaving the house in heavy steel handcuffs. Sarah realized her pleading was entirely useless. She slowly pushed herself off the hardwood floor. Her expensive makeup was smeared across her cheeks, making her look like a terrifying clown. She looked at her husband with absolute disgust. Mark did not even look back at her. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the heavy brass doorknob of the front door. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy keychain. He fumbled with the metal rings, his hands shaking violently as he detached the house key and the garage remote. He dropped them directly onto the floor. The metal clattered loudly against the polished wood, echoing like the final gavel strike in a courtroom. Sarah did the exact same thing, letting her keys slip from her trembling fingers. They walked toward the grand foyer, moving like 2 condemned prisoners walking toward the gallows. They stepped out into the freezing winter air, wearing nothing but the clothes they had put on that morning. They did not speak a single word to each other as they walked down the driveway toward the street, leaving their luxury cars parked uselessly behind them. Bradley stepped forward and firmly pushed the heavy oak door shut. The brass deadbolt clicked loudly, locking them out of my life forever. The immediate silence that followed was not empty or lonely. It was the profound, thick silence of absolute peace. The suffocating toxic energy that had infected every single room of my home for the past 12 months instantly evaporated. I walked over to the large living room window and watched their retreating figures grow smaller as they walked down the sidewalk, shivering in the cold. I felt my chest expand, drawing in a deep, clean breath for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The house was finally mine again. The lingering scent of Sarah's expensive perfume and Mark's arrogant cologne was already beginning to fade rapidly, replaced by the familiar comforting smell of old wood and old books. I turned to Bradley and simply nodded my head. He offered a small, respectful smile in return. He picked up his heavy leather briefcase and told me his firm would monitor the federal indictments closely. He let himself out the back door, leaving me completely alone in my reclaimed sanctuary. I did not have time to sit down and reflect on the victory. I had engineered this entire day with the meticulous precision of a military operation, and the next phase was already scheduled to begin. Exactly 15 minutes after Bradley departed, a large unmarked black van pulled smoothly into my driveway, parking directly behind Mark's abandoned luxury sedan. 4 men wearing dark tactical uniforms stepped out of the vehicle. They were not local handymen or cheap neighborhood locksmiths. They were elite contractors from a private corporate security firm I had hired earlier in the week, using the heavily protected funds from my newly established blind trust. The lead contractor, a tall, muscular man with a serious demeanor, walked up to the front porch and rang the bell. I opened the door and let them inside. I did not need to explain the situation or give them detailed instructions. I had already provided them with a comprehensive digital floor plan and a highly specific mandate. They immediately split into 2 distinct teams, moving through my home with cold, practiced efficiency. The first team immediately went to work on the physical access points. I watched as they systematically stripped the old brass deadbolts from the front door, the back patio, and the garage entrance. They replaced them with heavy-duty industrial-grade biometric locks that could only be accessed by my specific fingerprint. The second team focused entirely on the digital perimeter. They rapidly installed high-definition night vision cameras at every single exterior angle of the property, seamlessly wiring them into a secure private cloud server that I could monitor directly from my smartphone. They placed motion sensors on every ground floor window and reinforced the heavy sliding glass doors with solid steel security bars. The entire process took less than 2 hours. When the lead contractor finally handed me the master tablet controlling the new system, he assured me that absolutely nobody was getting onto this property without my explicit digital authorization. The security team packed up their equipment and drove away, leaving my fortress completely impenetrable. The silent adjustment was finally complete. I locked the new biometric deadbolt with a simple touch of my finger and walked toward the kitchen to make a fresh cup of tea. 6 months have passed since the cold winter afternoon. I locked the heavy brass deadbolt and completely severed my ties with the people who tried to destroy me. It is a beautiful Tuesday morning in early May. I am sitting on the wooden rocking chair on my back porch, holding a warm ceramic mug of premium roasted coffee. The garden Patricia and I planted together decades ago is in full bloom. The vibrant colors of the spring flowers are completely untouched by the toxic greed that once poisoned the hallways of my home. The silence that surrounds me now is not the heavy, suffocating quiet of a hostage waiting for the next attack. It is the deep, profound silence of absolute freedom. I take a slow, comfortable sip of my coffee and feel the gentle morning breeze against my face. The biometric locks on my doors and the high-definition cameras securing my perimeter have remained completely quiet for half a year. My fortress is secure, and my mind is entirely at peace. I reach down to the small wicker table beside my chair and pick up my digital tablet. I open the local financial news application. I do not actively search for their names anymore, but the sheer scale of the federal investigation made local headlines. I scroll past the daily market updates and see a prominent article detailing the final collapse of a major regional logistics company. The photograph beneath the headline shows Mark walking out of a federal courthouse. He is wearing a cheap, wrinkled orange jumpsuit, and his hands are secured in heavy metal chains. The arrogant smirk he used to wear while walking through my living room has been entirely erased from his face. The article details his formal indictment on 7 separate counts of federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The commercial debt collectors he tried to outrun completely dismantled his business, liquidating his delivery trucks for pennies on the dollar. The federal prosecutors utilized the exact forensic accounting file Bradley had prepared, leaving Mark with absolutely no room to negotiate a plea deal. He is currently sitting in a maximum security holding facility, waiting for a sentencing hearing that will mathematically ensure he spends the next 2 decades behind thick concrete walls. He gambled his entire life on a completely blank piece of paper, and he lost absolutely everything. I slowly swipe the screen to read the secondary details of the court proceedings. The article mentions the severe financial fallout impacting his immediate family. Sarah did not go to federal prison. The state prosecutors determined she was not a direct signatory on the fraudulent commercial credit lines. However, avoiding a prison cell did not save her from the devastating consequences of her own malice. Because she was legally married to Mark during the commission of his financial crimes, she was held entirely liable for the massive mountain of residual debt he left behind. The luxury vehicles were instantly repossessed by the banks. She was rapidly evicted from the expensive downtown apartment they tried to rent after I threw them out of my house. The woman who eagerly packed my worn-out sweatpants to send me to a state-run nightmare is currently working double shifts at a loud, crowded diner just to afford a tiny studio apartment on the absolute edge of the city. She spends her days carrying heavy trays of food and her nights dealing with aggressive debt collection agencies calling her phone incessantly. She wanted to inherit $3 million without lifting a single finger, and instead she inherited a lifetime of crushing, inescapable poverty. I press the power button on the side of my tablet, and the screen goes completely dark. I place the device back onto the wicker table and finish the last warm drop of my coffee. I stand up from the rocking chair, feeling incredibly strong and entirely capable. I walk back inside the house and head directly toward the grand foyer. Resting proudly on the polished hardwood floor is a matched set of expensive, genuine leather luggage. I am not packing for a miserable state facility today. I am packing for a month-long luxury vacation, traversing the beautiful historic coastlines of Italy. A sleek black town car pulls into my driveway right on schedule. The professional driver steps out and politely loads my heavy leather bags into the spacious trunk. I lock the front door, pressing my thumb against the biometric scanner, and listen to the satisfying mechanical click. I step into the comfortable back seat of the car and tell the driver to head directly toward the international airport. I protected my home and I perfectly secured my legacy. The silent adjustment is officially complete, and I am finally moving forward with the absolute dignity I have always deserved. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that shared blood does not automatically guarantee shared loyalty or basic human respect. We are often taught to sacrifice everything for our children. But true love should never require the complete destruction of your own dignity and financial security. I learned that it is infinitely better to stand completely alone with your peace of mind intact than to surround yourself with people who view you only as a resource to be exploited. Setting ironclad boundaries is not a sign of selfishness, but the ultimate act of self-preservation. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you agree that true family is built on mutual respect, and share your own stories of setting healthy boundaries in the comments below.
Welcome to the Story Channel. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few notes. The content in this video uses AI-generated images and voice narration, combined with the channel's creative editing. Everything is intended solely for entertainment purposes and does not depict or reflect any real events or real people. Hope you enjoy the story and have a great time watching.